inspires me is having been born in Mississippi in 1943 and watching as I grew up, watching the treatment of my family, treatment especially of my father. My father was this big, tall man, who just was treated so awful in so many places. And so as his daughter, as I watched this, one experience in particular was I watched as he was spit on by this white man who he worked for. And I watched my father. I remember watching my father because the man, even at that young age, understood that the rage and hate that would have had to be inside of him to make him do this to someone like my father. Even at that age, I could understand that. What I couldn't understand was that my father stood taller and took his huge protective hand, put it on my head as I was this little girl, and we walked. It's kind of like when you hold someone's hand.
Right.
Well, he put his hand on top of my head and turned me, and we walked away. And he never said a word, but the energy that he really transmitted to me from that experience has left me with a better, greater, deeper commitment to mastery of myself. So I wanted to understand how the mechanisms for coping gave him that strength, exactly. So what I tried to do in creating the Cultural Wellness Center was create an alternative, which meant we had to deal with transformation and becoming. How do you change? How you move from one stage to another. How do you ground your vision of change from I want things to change to I want things to change to a better and more deeply, what I say, spiritual and cultural way. The way of knowing, the way of thinking, the way of producing something different. If it's transformational, it has to come from something different than what the racism that we're fighting came from. In other words, you can't solve the problem and you can't create transformation out of the same thing that produced the kind of strategy and hatred that we are trying to transform. You have to have an alternative. So I think that's what my work has been about, that culture has to include spirituality. So it has to. It can't. If spirituality is not present, then culture is not present. So language and values and customs and beliefs that come from a spiritual ground is what we try to put in place. And we see it play out in the classrooms with the children that we work with. We see it play out particularly with African American children that we work with, where children are expressing a level of frustration and rage, and where does that come from at age 7, 10, and 12? And what we're really beginning to see is that it comes from the lack of capacity, again, to express what they are, what's going on inside. So if you think about what spiritual values are, they are more internal. So what we try to do is to say, tell us what's happening with whatever words you have, and that then will tell us what's happening in your spirit. And we try to really teach the children and work with children and show them that deeper levels of thinking and deeper levels of imagining something different will give them the capacity to once again transform any situation they're in. So as we teach cultural classes, so that means that we In the classroom, we expose children to, once again, those things that culture brings. So what does language bring? Having them think about their language, think about their people, and think about their family system, their community, and think it through and say, what is it that you get from this family? And in many cases, if it doesn't feel good to the children, then we say, what would you create if you had the opportunity?
Empower them.
What would you create? Right. What would be the alternative to that kind of sadness? And it's an amazing experience to watch the children come up with things that we think comes from the internal kind of process. And this work that we're doing is anti-racism work.
Uh-huh.
In other words, it is, it's the alternative
Countering.
to, yes,
Yeah.
it's the alternative to what currently exists, that we can't fight things and replace them unless you have something to put in their place. And so that's the approach that we're using at this point. We have practitioners and clinicians, and whether they're educators or, as I said, healthcare providers, who come here to relearn a way of living and being that does challenge the institutional practices that are racist and are judgmental. And so our
That are
approach
part
to
of the
it
structures.
is,
right? Yeah.
our approach to it is that people, individuals, this personal transformation has to start from the inside out. And no matter where we work and no matter what position we hold, we are a part of the problem. And now we must together become a part of the solution.
What drives one personally, I think, is really a challenging question. It's more challenging than it seems because it really causes you to have to look at yourself. And as I've thought about transformation and leadership in any organization, certainly true for the church, I think one has to have an experience of love and caring in your own life, whether it came formatively, as a child, and I know that a lot of people haven't been blessed with that kind of experience as children, but somewhere along the line, one has had to come to know the reality and the experience of being cared about and being cared for and being valued as a human being. Again, goes back to my childhood. I grew up on a dairy farm, and dairy farmers are 7-day-a-week people in terms of the work life. It was my parents were religious people, churchgoers, so they honored the Sabbath as much as you could at a dairy farm. The cows still needed to be milked, but Sunday was their day off. But often, what my parents did with their Sunday, even though it was like the only time they had off, was go visit some elderly members of the church. And as I've thought about that in terms of how that's influenced me in terms of anti-racism work, it wouldn't call going and visiting elderly people as acts of justice, but it has the same thread in that it poses the question, who's included and who is excluded. In this case, there are elderly folks that couldn't get back to church that were being excluded. Not because of anything anybody is doing, but because of the way life was for them. I bring that same kind of question, I guess, into the anti-racism work. And so, I think about that kind of formative experience. I look at it in terms of a broader picture of, race and fairness and justice here in our own nation and beyond. And the question, once you start asking the question, who is included and who is excluded, and then start asking the questions of why is it that way, you find yourself, as long as you keep asking those questions, on a journey that you really can't stop. You just have to keep following where those questions, in the Christian tradition, for example, the language of being born again, that's been narrowed in a lot of sectors to mean something very, in my judgment, small. But really, it's about transformation. It's about being born into a new life, a new way of seeing things, a new discovery. That's what anti-racism work is about. In the Christian tradition, one talks about dying to an old way of life and rising to a new way of life. These are powerful metaphors for change and transformation. Those are kind of personal. And then in our tradition, we also have the metaphor of the kingdom of God or the realm of God, which is the Lord's Prayer that's offered in most churches every Sunday. When one unpacks that stuff and takes it seriously, and doesn't just become stuff that you're repeating, it is really about change, social change. It's about a justice movement, and it's about transformation on a big scale. So one thing that's been important for me is continued commitment to my own growth and learning. I don't think I can be an effective leader if I don't continue that process. And I have continued to discover, those things that I was absolutely unaware of, and continue to be surprised that being a part of, anti-racism work and being on that journey has given me more courage than I would otherwise have. And that's been manifest in a couple ways. I have a lot more courage in terms of being engaged relationally with people of color. I think a lot of white folks, and I would have had to include myself, have an innate anxiety about engaging with people of color. I am mindful that it's not about earning, merit badges for your good work in anti-racism. I can't bring that with me into a new relationship and say, here, look what I've done. Every new engagement, every new relationship is a fresh start. And whoever I'm engaging with, they don't know me from anybody else other white guy that they've encountered over, their lives. And so that's where I have to start. And that means I have to start with a good deal of humility and, openness in this situation. But my own preaching is certainly reflective of anti-racism commitment. It's a lens. It's a lens through which I come to sacred texts and the dynamics of our sacred text, Scripture. The story of empires and injustice are all through that, from the Hebrew Scriptures into the Gospels. And so once you begin to understand a little more clearly dynamics of racism, it's not hard to understand the intersections between the dynamics of empire and injustice and how that played out thousands of years ago and how it continues to play out today. Anti-racism work, in my judgment, is not for Lone Rangers. It's for people working collaboratively and collectively. And so if one wants to be serious about anti-racism work, one has to be serious about forming community and building community. And again, you can have a religious expression of that as a church community. You can have a secular expression of it, some other types of communities. But being in partnership and being in collaboration and having a support network, I think, is vital for anti-racism work. It just can't be done alone. And that's not just a strategic question of numbers, but it's really a question of internal support. It is really walking into the difficult and painful stuff of life. And so in order to do that and not become discouraged and depressed and give up, you need a community of support.
My name is Leon Rodriguez. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer for the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities. Well, I think the first thing is I share a legacy with many other South Africans, having lived under apartheid oppression in South Africa. And I moved to the United States after South Africa's political settlement, just to find that in the United States people still struggle with race, people still struggle with oppression, People still struggle with discrimination. And I work in an organization where I think we deal with a lot of the residual effects of that era of racism, of segregation. And we need to transform our organizations to be inclusive, to value and validate the presence of those whose value may at some point in history been questioned or even subjugated. And our organizations need to be more inclusive of that. So when you talk about transformation, I think it starts off with ourselves. We are born human if we prefer to believe that, but there are processes in society and the way society has been socially constructed that tell us we are less human. For example, we could not vote. We were disenfranchised. We could not apply for the same jobs as everybody else. We could not live in certain neighborhoods. There was a time we could not even get education, which meant that we were not good enough or inferior, or we just had less value. Also acknowledging the pain, the hurt, the abuse that we have to overcome, that we have been affected by that, and that we need to reclaim the fact that we have value, and that we should not allow those things to hold us back. Unfortunately, today we still see people dealing with internalized racial oppression. We see people subjected to hegemony, so thinking that they cannot make a contribution or that their contribution is not acceptable. In order to oppress or to regard somebody as inferior, you have to have a very defunct view of who you are. And it's actually a lack of your own humanity if you believe that somebody is not fully human as you are. In order to hurt somebody and to abuse somebody, you also have to put aside those deeply inherent human qualities about caring and compassion. And in order to continue that oppression, you have to certainly put that aside. One thing I have been working on over the past few years is also dealing with trauma. But when I think about trauma, I also think about the bystander. The bystander is also traumatized. So what did it mean for people watching the civil rights marches and watching people getting shot and tear gassed and chased down with dogs? What did it mean for those? It also traumatized those people. And so they too need to think about how do they get healing and how do they overcome that trauma. So the first thing I would say is we need to create the spaces where we can tell our stories, where both the traumatized and those bystanders can tell those stories. I think it was Dr. King that said in one of his eloquent statements was he looks forward to the day when the children of former slaves and former slave owners can sit at the table together. That means dealing with that trauma. That means doing something in order to sit at the table together. And if we look at our workplaces today, we are still pretty much separated. And unfortunately, when we are not intentional about that, we tend to suppress that generation upon generation, and that leads to dysfunction and that leads to pathology. And if not dealt with, it comes out in ways that we least expect it, and maybe in ways that might be much, much more complex to deal with. So my daily undertaking in my organization is to create more intentionality, to create more validity for this kind of discussion, and also for people to learn to engage with each other. You know, everybody talks about diversity, everybody talks about inclusion, but only to a limited point. We are thinking more about authentic engagement, and what does that mean? It means accepting each other with all of the baggage and being prepared to work through that so that we can move from what I would call pseudo-community to more authentic community. as a young activist, I was very angry. I was deeply resentful. I saw how my parents had been treated by ordinary people on the street, ordinary privileged white people in South Africa, and I struggled with that. I felt the need to assert myself, and if I needed to use other means, I would get back at them by any means necessary. I've learned great lessons from people like Mahatma Gandhi, who has a great legacy in South Africa, as well as Dr. Martin Luther King, who had the philosophy of nonviolence, and I firmly believe in that. I feel deeply within the human spirit is something like compassion, and it is compassion for those in need. And we might not always all have material need. We might have other needs, some psychological needs, a need to be loved and to love someone else. And that's what I find we need to develop in our society as we overcome some of these differences. Of course, the first layer that people always resort to is anger. When we think about the stages of grief, when we're confronted with a very stark reality, we have to allow people to get through that so that the real work can actually happen. And that's what I do on a daily basis as a practitioner in my organization. Raise awareness, and secondly, challenge people to action, and a much deeper action. And I've talked a lot about individual action. I'm a firm believer also in collective action.
Let me tell you how I got into healthcare. So I read Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, back in 1962 when I was in high school. And it said there were 40 to 50 million people in this country that were really not benefiting from the American dream. And they were basically the poor and the people of color. And that really struck me, and when I read that book, and then I realized over the next several years that John Kennedy also had read that book, and he developed this war on poverty. Well, he started it, and Lyndon Johnson carried it on, and it was making a huge difference in communities, particularly communities of color. And that resonated with me because where I grew up, we didn't have any people of color, and I was really interested in what was going on throughout the states, and seeing the changes that were made, and knowing that this world was much bigger than what I was seeing in my little hometown. So that sort of stuck. When I was 8 years old, my dad took me to a Green Bay Packer game, and that's when I saw the first African American in my life, and his name was Bobby Mann. He was a running back for the Green Bay Packers. First African American I'd ever seen. And I asked my dad about that as we were walking home, and he said, yeah, he can only come into town during the football season, and he then needs to leave when the season is done. And he can't live in town, he has to live on the outskirts of town. And I reflected to my dad, that doesn't seem fair. And my dad said, no, that isn't fair. So I'm hoping that your generation actually does something about that. So that was sort of a seminal point where I had to really think about, there's some expectations that my generation maybe can do something to make things better for a lot of people. So that was certainly one particular incident. But certainly as I became Commissioner of Health, and we started asking folks around the state what creates health, and recognizing that many populations, particularly of color and American Indians, are not benefiting from all of the benefits of the state, it really became clear that we needed to really address health equity in a really proactive way. Just looking at the data, looking at the pain that people are under, looking at the situations that people don't really have any opportunities to be healthy. They're in situations where they're really refrained from benefiting from all of the things in our state. We've been working with, even before I became health commissioner, we were really working with communities about how to create health and how to deal with disparities. But becoming the health commissioner gave me a platform to really take it to a different level and get some visibility on this issue. So we developed the Advancing Health Equity Report, which identified the fact that disparities are a huge problem in this state, and that they're really not about access to medical care and personal choices. It's really about the socio-political climate, the socioeconomic climate that people are in. So we said, if we're going to really be a healthy state, we've got the best medical care system in the country. We really overall are a very healthy state on average, but we have these huge disparities that and as our population is changing, unless we really address those disparities, we'll not be able to maintain our status as a healthy state. So in order to do that, we have to deal with health equity. And the issue that most people don't want to talk about is race, and the disparities we have in race, and the lack of opportunities that people of color and American Indians don't have because of some of the policies that are in place that have been put there many, many years ago, but are impacting them negatively. And so we decided that that's where we would lead. We would lead with the discussion about race as one way of getting at all of the policies and the systems that benefit whites at the expense of people of color and American Indians. Well, certainly when we were looking at the Central Corridor light rail, they did not pay attention to the people in the middle of that line, particularly people of color in the middle of the line, low-income folks, where there are no stops. And really to see the community come forward and say, you know, we're being disadvantaged by that policy that says you have to move people as rapidly as possible. You're paying attention to only one criterion. That's the efficiency of it. You're not paying attention to the population needs. And so with their advocacy and their organizing and their really creating a movement, they were able to get 3 stops. Not only that, they actually changed federal policy on how to evaluate transportation, things like the Central Corridor light rail. It really reflected that it's the power of communities coming together to address policies that really disadvantage some. Income is a huge issue. So we developed a report on income and health. And from our studies, it really showed that if you increase somebody's income from the lowest 20% up into the next category, you actually could increase their life expectancy by about 3.5 years. That little bit of investment at the low income level is really, really important for health. That it says that we have to take an approach that is broader than what we traditionally have done in the health department. So we're taking now at the health department a health and all policies approach, where we really say we need to partner with transportation and housing and economic development and corrections as a team to create the conditions in which people can be healthy. But do it with a health lens. How does it actually improve health? And with a health equity lens, how does it reduce disparities and how does it advance health equity? So that when the Department of Transportation is building a road, how can we make sure that everybody in the community can benefit, that it actually enhances health as opposed to detracting from health? How does it build the capacity of those communities, build the opportunities in those communities, those opportunities for health? Because we know that if everybody benefits, as Paul Wellstone said, everybody benefits. And we know from the data that if we can reduce the income inequality, everybody's going to get healthier, even the people at the top. So if DEED and economic development looks at economic development through that equity lens and that disparity lens, I think we're going to have a really healthier state. And it'll be because everybody's doing it together. And a lot of it's personal stories of things that I've learned or where I am and what I'm learning from a conference that I'm going at and some of my reflections on that. And I recognize that when I tell a story that reflects about something I'm doing, people often open up and are willing to share a little bit about what they're doing, or they reflect on the same kind of thing from a little different angle. You need to be open, a little vulnerable to sharing a little bit about your personal story, and people will share back.
My name is Maria Isa. I am a singer, songwriter, actress, activist. I feel that the inspiration of my work definitely started at a young age from the movement working alongside, or I say working alongside, but being around my mother, who is is still a human rights activist and advocate for women's rights, and showcasing how far we've came as people of color, however, how much more work there is to do in my generation. Growing up around people in power as far as politicians, as well as the people who volunteer to make sure that our voices are being heard. Let's not look at the color when we're talking in a circle. Let's talk about the issues. And then we can bring in the color, and you'll see the statistics there. And that's how we can move forward. And if people are neglecting the fact that that racism doesn't exist, they're tripping. I'm going to say they're tripping. Let's read the headlines. Let's see how much negative is being written and not the positives that are being told about people of color. Our main goal is to unite, not to divide. Our main goal is to educate, because we live in a world where, like I said, history is not being told how it's came up. Can't be figuring it out that everybody wants us to live in a Disney world, and it's not going to happen that way, because we obviously know that there is pros, there's cons, and a lot of the cons are the evidence of the racial barriers that are placed. It's about learning more a little bit about ourselves and being able to engage in conversations with people who may not want to even hear it, but enforcing that. And those hashtags and those tags and those tweets are what enforces that. If you have 13,000 people retweeting something regarding a video that's happened or a movement that's escalating behind health rights or the DREAM Act, that's a momentum that boosts that energy. However, it's not just retweeting it. Let's take it out, and like I said, let's talk about it. Let's have a circle. You don't have to be a musician or a professional. You have it right here in your soul and your heart. And everybody knows what's right, and everybody knows what's wrong. I feel like I was born to be an artist. It wasn't to say I want to make movies right now, or I can do. It was more like I can do it. It's just a natural feeling. It's kind of interesting. I'm sure all artists can feel the same. You do it because you're passionate. There's a difference. Some people do it thinking that there's a big ticket or a big Lamborghini waiting for them outside. However, the activism part is something that I learned that I had to do when I seen so many issues happen to people, to myself, and utilizing the art to be able to express to people maybe don't want to hear it. I grew up going to school with, people who their parents were racist. You know what I'm saying? Did not want me to bring up the issues that we overcome, or did not like maybe who my mom and I were attending their political campaigns, and I try to take away like the political stance of who to endorse. I'm more about who's speaking my story and who feels and who's actually out on those streets working with it. That activism part came about saying, I was probably 11 years old, and that's at the time when I recognized I can make a difference. I don't have to go that route. I don't want to be a statistic. I want to go ahead and try and make sure that those who are blindfolded to seeing that they're going to be in a statistic, I want to help them take that off. I want them to know that we have a right, and whether you want to be in medical school, in law school, everybody has a power and a force. Whether you want to create and design shoes, we all can work together and find and fuel a better tomorrow for children and people of color. If I can inspire my grandmother, who's 95 years old, to think a different way from her values, 80 years ago, it's like hold a globe in your hand. Look at the world. See, yes, it's big, but recognize how small it is, and recognize how much you can leave an effect on it if you were to interact with so many different people and create positivity. Racism song. I have a song called Steve Jobs.
Okay.
Oh, sweet.
It's pretty deep, so, but fun. La sangre llama, no lo puede negar. La historia de los esclavos no se puede olvidar. Cada día trabajamos, tienen que respetar, tienen que respetar, tienen que respetar. Steve Jobs took all the jobs, locked up the mob, paid off the cops, poisoned the crops, put us in a box, and we're still down from pork chops. Steve Jobs, career sabotage, burned down the mob, set fires to the fires, raised up the costs, gentrified the block and put a Whole Food in the Bronx. The economy's a rap, the ghetto is a trap, the president is black and the mayor smoking crack. Even though the war is all about the poor, can't afford Tom Ford, can't ignore Rob Ford. Record labels won't even pay for your tour. The devil wants more, the devil wants more. East 94 with my pedal to the floor, thinking about little Bebel Blood Sugar 94. I know they got a cure, but they want to keep it hidden, secrets. I get it, I need it. I'm at the mall, 30 milligrams of Adderall. Welcome to the Valley of the Dolls. Steve Jobs took all the jobs, locked up the mob, paid off the cops, poisoned the crops, put us in a box, and we're still dying from pork chops. Steve Jobs, career sabotage. Burned down the mosque, set fires to the fires, raised up the cost, gentrified the block and put a Whole Food in the Bronx. Step into the drum, 1 green cigarette, 3 shots of rum. Some say you're crazy if you speak in tongues. Sign of the cross from the nun, but I could be healed by the stars and sun. Said I could be healed by the stars and sun. Snowden on the run, I hope he has a gun, cause when Popo come, they poke a hole in the fun. Puerto Rican rum poured out for Big Pump. Ruppa pum pum, tuku tuku dum dum. Black blunt punctured hole in my lung. But wars being won by the songs that are sung. The wars being won by the songs that are sung. The wars being won by the songs that are sung. La sangre llama, no lo puede negar. La historia de los esclavos no se puede olvidar. Cada día trabajamos, tienes que estar. Tienen que respetar. Tienen que respetar. Steve Jobs, Steve Jobs.